Welcome to True Crime Mysteries, where we investigate cases that stumped investigators for years. Today, we're exploring the only unsolved act of air piracy in American commercial aviation history. A man boarded a plane, hijacked it in midair, collected $200,000 in ransom, strapped on a parachute, and jumped into a dark and stormy sky over the Pacific Northwest. And then he simply vanished. No body, no confirmed identity, no arrest. Just a stack of cash, a cigarette butt, and a mystery that has haunted the FBI for more than 50 years. Here's what happened. It was the night before Thanksgiving, 1971. Millions of Americans were boarding planes, packing cars, and preparing for the holiday. But somewhere between Portland, Oregon and Seattle, Washington, one man had a very different agenda. He had no interest in turkey and stuffing. He had a briefcase, a parachute demand, and a plan so audacious that 50 years of investigative effort by the Federal Bureau of Investigation has never untangled it. He is known to the world simply as D.B. Cooper. And to this day, no one knows who he really was. The D.B. Cooper case is one of those rare stories that sits at the crossroads of true crime, adventure myth, and genuine unsolved mystery. It has inspired novels, films, television documentaries, and countless amateur investigations. It has generated thousands of tips to the FBI, produced dozens of named suspects, and yielded almost nothing in the way of definitive answers. The FBI formally suspended active investigation of the case in July 2016, after more than 4 decades of work. They closed the book, but the case was never solved. The mystery remains exactly that, a mystery. So today, we are going to walk through everything we know. The hijacking itself, moment by moment. The ransom demand and how the FBI responded. The parachute jump into a storm-swept wilderness. The forensic evidence that survived the investigation. The suspects the FBI considered over the decades. And the one tantalizing physical clue that surfaced 9 years after the crime, raising more questions than it answered. We are going to dig into all of it, drawing entirely from public records, the FBI's own case files, and verified historical sources. Because this story is extraordinary enough on its own. It does not need embellishment. Let's go back to the beginning. November 24, 1971. Portland International Airport. It is a Wednesday, the day before Thanksgiving, and the airport is busy with holiday travelers. Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 is preparing for a short hop north to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The flight time is less than an hour. It is, by all outward appearances, an utterly routine short-haul commercial flight on a Boeing 727 jetliner. A man approaches the Northwest Orient ticket counter at Portland Airport and purchases a one-way ticket for Flight 305. He pays cash. He gives the name Dan Cooper. That name, as we will see, will become one of the most scrutinized aliases in the history of American law enforcement. It is not his real name. Or at least, investigators have never been able to confirm that it is. The man who buys that ticket under the name Dan Cooper walks to his gate, boards the aircraft, and takes a seat in the rear of the plane. Seat 18C, an aisle seat toward the back of the cabin. Contemporary accounts and the FBI's published case materials describe this man as appearing to be in his mid-40s. He is described as approximately 5 feet 10 inches to 6 feet tall, of average build, with dark hair combed back. He is wearing a dark business suit, a white dress shirt, a black tie with a mother-of-pearl tie clip, and dark sunglasses. He carries a black attaché case. He appears calm, unremarkable, the kind of man you would forget the moment he walked away from you. Flight 305 departs Portland with 36 passengers and a crew of 6 aboard. The crew includes Captain William Scott, First Officer William Radachak, Flight Engineer Harold Anderson, and flight attendants Tina Mucklow, Florence Schaffner, and Alice Hancock. These are the people who will spend the next several hours of their professional lives in direct contact with one of the most wanted criminals in American history. And they handle it with remarkable professionalism. Remember their names. They matter. Shortly after takeoff, the man in seat 18C calls flight attendant Florence Schaffner over to him. He hands her a note. Schaffner, assuming it is the kind of note a lonely traveler sometimes passes to an attractive flight attendant, reportedly drops it into her pocket without reading it. The man leans toward her and says something to the effect of, "Miss, you'd better look at that note." Florence Schaffner reads the note. And the tone of this flight changes entirely. According to the FBI's published account of the case, the note informs the flight attendant that the man has a bomb. He instructs her to sit down next to him. She does. He opens his attaché case just enough for her to see what is inside. Schaffner later describes seeing red cylinders, wires, and what appears to be a battery. Whether the device was a genuine explosive or an elaborate prop has never been confirmed. But in that moment, it does not matter. The threat is credible. The hijacking has begun. The man gives Schaffner his demands. He wants $200,000 in negotiable American currency. He wants 4 parachutes, specifically 2 primary parachutes and 2 reserve parachutes. And he wants a fuel truck standing by in Seattle to refuel the aircraft upon landing. Schaffner carries this information to the cockpit. Captain Scott radios Seattle Air Traffic Control and relays the situation. The FBI is notified. Northwest Orient Airlines management is contacted. And within a short period of time, the machinery of law enforcement and airline management is in motion. Here's where things get genuinely interesting. The airline and the FBI make a decision. They decide to comply with the hijacker's demands. Their reasoning is straightforward. The safety of the passengers and crew is the paramount concern. 36 passengers are on that plane. If this man has a real bomb, confronting him in the air could be catastrophic. And so the decision is made to give him what he wants. Northwest Orient Airlines, working with the FBI and local law enforcement on the ground in Seattle, assembles $200,000 in $20 bills. The serial numbers of these bills are photographed, creating a record that the FBI will later make public and use to track potential spending of the ransom money. The 4 parachutes are also obtained and brought to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The aircraft circles over Puget Sound for approximately 2 hours while the ransom and parachutes are assembled. During this time, the flight attendant Tina Mucklow, who had taken over primary communication with the hijacker, is speaking with him. She later tells investigators that he seems knowledgeable about the Seattle area. He is calm throughout. He drinks bourbon and soda. He smokes cigarettes, specifically a brand later identified from the butts as Raleigh filter cigarettes. He is polite. Investigators and journalists who later comb through witness accounts note that multiple crew members describe him as not hostile or aggressive, but businesslike, almost eerily composed. Think about that for a moment. This man is sitting in the rear of a commercial aircraft, having just declared himself a hijacker and bomb carrier, circling over the Pacific Northwest while the FBI scrambles to meet his demands. And he is calmly drinking bourbon and waiting. Does this suggest someone who had done this kind of thing before? Or simply someone who had planned this moment so thoroughly that he had no fear left? That is a question investigators would ask for decades. Flight 305 lands at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport at approximately 5:45 in the evening. It parks on a remote section of the tarmac, away from the main terminal. The hijacker's demands are met at the aircraft. A Northwest Orient employee named Bill Radachak, serving as first officer on the flight, is informed that the ransom bag and parachutes are being brought to the plane. A Northwest Orient ground employee delivers the money and the parachutes to the aircraft door. $200,000 in $20 bills. The bills are bound into packets. The total weight of this much cash in 20s is approximately 21 pounds. The bills are placed in a canvas bank bag. The 4 parachutes are also delivered. The hijacker inspects the parachutes. Once he is satisfied, he allows all 36 passengers to disembark. All of them, every single passenger walks off that plane safely in Seattle. 2 flight attendants, Florence Schaffner and Alice Hancock, are also permitted to leave. Remaining on board are Captain Scott, First Officer Radachak, Flight Engineer Anderson, and Flight Attendant Tina Mucklow. The hijacker has kept them. He needs the crew to fly the plane. And he needs Mucklow, it seems, because she has been his primary point of contact and he trusts the communication channel they have established. The hijacker now gives his instructions for the next leg of the flight. He wants the aircraft flown to Mexico City. He specifies the flight parameters in a way that will strike investigators as deeply significant. He instructs the crew to fly at a maximum altitude of 10,000 feet. He specifies an airspeed of no more than 150 knots, which is very slow for a commercial jet. He wants the landing gear left in the down position, and he specifies a flight path heading southeast, over the Oregon-Washington border region. The crew tells him that with those flight parameters, particularly the low altitude and slow airspeed and extended landing gear, the aircraft cannot make it all the way to Mexico City without refueling. The aircraft does not have the fuel range under those conditions. The hijacker accepts this. He says they will stop in Reno, Nevada to refuel. Now, here is something that investigators have spent enormous energy analyzing. The flight parameters this man specifies are not the kind of thing a casual traveler would know to ask for. Flying at low altitude, slow airspeed, with gear down, on a specific southward heading, these are conditions that someone would specify if they intended to parachute from the rear of the aircraft and wanted to minimize the risks of doing so. The Boeing 727 is one of the very few commercial jet aircraft with an aft air stair, a staircase at the rear of the aircraft that can be opened and deployed in flight. The hijacker knows this. He has chosen this specific aircraft type. He has chosen this specific exit strategy. Whoever this man is, he has done his homework. Flight 305 departs Seattle at approximately 7:40 in the evening on November 24, 1971. The aircraft is now heading southeast, low and slow, through the dark Pacific Northwest sky. It is raining. Temperatures at altitude in that region on that night were well below freezing. The conditions are, by any reasonable assessment, terrible for a parachute jump. Tina Mucklow is in communication with the hijacker as the plane departs Seattle. At some point after takeoff, she reports that the hijacker instructs her to go to the cockpit and stay there. She does. The cockpit door is closed. At approximately 8 o'clock in the evening, the crew observes a warning light on the instrument panel indicating that the aft air stair has been activated. Someone is opening the rear staircase. The crew makes an offer, reported in FBI case documents, to come back and assist him. The hijacker declines. He tells them to stay in the cockpit. And then, at some point between 8 and 8:15 in the evening on November 24, 1971, the man known as D.B. Cooper, carrying a canvas bag containing $200,000 in cash and one of the 4 parachutes, steps off the rear air stair of a Boeing 727 in flight. He jumps into a dark, cold, rainy sky somewhere over the southern Washington or northern Oregon wilderness. And he is never seen again. The aircraft lands in Reno, Nevada at approximately 10:15 that evening. Federal agents and law enforcement are waiting on the tarmac. They board the aircraft and search it thoroughly. The hijacker is not on board. The 2 reserve parachutes he was given are still on the aircraft. He has taken only the money bag and 2 of the parachutes. Notably, one of the 2 parachutes he left behind was a training parachute, one that had been sewn shut and was non-functional, supplied by a local skydiving school that had apparently misunderstood what was needed. He left that one behind. He also left behind the other reserve chute. He took what he needed and nothing more. The FBI immediately launches what will become one of the largest and most sustained criminal investigations in Bureau history. They call it Operation NORJAK, short for Northwest Hijacking. Military aircraft and ground search teams begin combing the area of Washington and Oregon wilderness over which Flight 305 was flying when the jump occurred. The FBI has radar data from the flight, giving investigators an approximate zone of where the jump likely happened. That zone encompasses a stretch of dense, heavily forested wilderness in southwestern Washington state, around the Columbia River Valley in the area near Ariel, Washington. Search teams go out in the days and weeks following the hijacking. Soldiers from Fort Lewis are deployed to search the area on foot. Aircraft conduct aerial surveys. The terrain is punishing. Dense Douglas fir forest, steep ridge lines, river valleys, swampy lowlands. It is the kind of wilderness that swallows things whole. No parachute is found. No money. No body. No trace. Now, let's talk about what the FBI's investigation actually turned up in terms of physical evidence. Because while the searches came up empty in those early months, investigators did collect some pieces of evidence from the aircraft itself that would anchor every suspect analysis for the next 50 years. From the aircraft, investigators recovered cigarette butts, later identified as Raleigh filter cigarettes. They recovered what appeared to be a portion of a tie left behind at the hijacker's seat. This tie would become one of the most analyzed physical artifacts in the history of American criminal investigation. Investigators also had the witness descriptions from the flight crew, particularly from Tina Mucklow, who had spent more time in direct contact with the hijacker than anyone else. A composite sketch was developed from these descriptions and released publicly. And investigators had the serial numbers of all 10,000 $20 bills that had been handed over as ransom. The tie is worth examining closely. It was left on the seat. Whether intentionally or accidentally has been debated. Over the decades, the FBI subjected this tie to repeated forensic examination as techniques improved. In 2009, a private investigative team working on the case, in coordination with information that became publicly available through the FBI's own releases, conducted analysis of particles found on the tie. According to reporting based on FBI case materials at that time, investigators identified microscopic particles on the tie that included rare metal elements, specifically titanium, which was consistent with materials used in certain industrial or manufacturing processes in the 1960s and early 1970s. The significance of these particles would be debated extensively in connection with various suspects, as we will discuss. The witness descriptions generated a composite sketch that was widely circulated. The sketch shows a man with strong, somewhat angular facial features, dark hair combed back, appearing to be somewhere in his 40s. Every passenger and crew member who gave a description noted his calm, composed demeanor. Several noted that he appeared to be of what they perceived as a Mediterranean or possibly Native American complexion, though descriptions varied. No one noted any obvious distinguishing marks or scars. He was, in the recollections of those who sat near him, a man who blended in even while doing something that should have been impossible to conceal. So here is the question that defines the first phase of this investigation, and I want you to think about this for a moment. A man boards a plane in Portland. He successfully hijacks it. He extracts $200,000 from law enforcement and an airline corporation. He parachutes from a commercial jet in full flight into a dark wilderness in a rainstorm in near-freezing conditions. And then he vanishes completely. What do you think happened to him? Did he survive that jump? Did he die in the wilderness and simply was never found? Or did he land safely, walk out of the trees, and spend the next 50 years living under a different name somewhere in America? Drop your answer in the comments. We want to know what you think. Because that question, survival versus death, has been central to every theory investigators and armchair detectives have developed about this case. And the evidence actually cuts both ways. Let's lay it out. The case for survival is substantial. First, this man chose his aircraft carefully. The Boeing 727 with its aft air stair is one of very few commercial jets from which a parachute jump is even theoretically feasible. He knew this. That speaks to advanced planning and knowledge. Second, he specified flight parameters, low altitude, slow airspeed, that would make a jump survivable in a way that a jump from cruise altitude and speed would not be. That also speaks to advanced planning. Third, he inspected the parachutes personally when they were delivered. He made choices about which ones to take. He appeared to understand what he was looking at. The case against survival is also real. The weather conditions on the night of November 24, 1971 were, by all accounts, severe. Temperatures at jump altitude were estimated to be near 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The man was wearing a business suit. He had loafers on his feet, not boots. He was jumping at night, into wilderness terrain, in a rainstorm, with whatever level of parachuting skill he actually possessed. Experienced skydivers and military parachutists who have analyzed this case have expressed serious doubts about whether even a trained jumper could have survived those conditions in that clothing. And yet no body has ever been found. No parachute, nothing. The FBI searched the target zone extensively in the days following the hijacking. Additional searches were conducted over subsequent years as new information suggested possible landing zones. The wilderness of southwestern Washington is vast and, in places, extraordinarily difficult to search on foot. The absence of a body in such terrain does not necessarily mean the person survived. It may simply mean that the forest kept its secret. Let's talk about the money. The FBI photographed every single one of the $10,020 bills before handing them over. The serial numbers were made public. Banks were alerted to watch for these bills. The public was informed of the serial number ranges. If this man survived and tried to spend the money, there was a very real chance of being caught. And yet for 9 years after the hijacking, not a single bill from the ransom was ever found or reported. 9 years. Not one bill. Then in February 1980, a young boy named Brian Ingram was on a family picnic along the north bank of the Columbia River, near a place called Tina Bar in Clark County, Washington. Brian was digging in the sandy riverbank, as children at picnic spots do, and he uncovered a bundle of disintegrating, rotting paper currency. He brought the discovery to his parents. His parents examined the bills. The serial numbers matched. The money was from the D.B. Cooper ransom. 3 packets of bills, a total of 294 individual $20 bills, with a face value of $5,880, had surfaced from the Columbia River sediment 9 years and 3 months after the hijacking. This was the only confirmed recovery of any of the ransom money in the entire history of the case. And it raised more questions than it answered. How did the money get there? Tina Bar is on the Columbia River, downstream from the estimated jump zone, which is consistent with bills traveling by water. But the question of when the money entered the river and how it came to rest there has never been definitively answered. If the money washed into the river from the landing zone, that suggests the hijacker landed somewhere in the watershed. If he was carrying the money when he died, or if the bag simply came loose during the jump or landing, the cash would have entered the water at some point and traveled downstream. However, geological analysis of how the bills were buried in the sediment has been a matter of significant debate among investigators and independent researchers. Some investigators have argued that the pattern of burial suggests the money was deposited at Tina Bar relatively late, perhaps as recently as a few years before discovery in 1980, rather than having rested there since 1971. If that is the case, it could mean someone placed the money there, whether intentionally or accidentally. Other investigators have argued the burial pattern is consistent with natural deposition over a longer period of time. The FBI's own analysis has not produced a definitive public conclusion on this question. What the money discovery does establish definitively is this: some of the ransom cash from the D.B. Cooper hijacking ended up in the Columbia River watershed. The remaining roughly $194,000 in bills has never been found, never been spent, never surfaced. Nowhere, in over 50 years. Now let's turn to the investigation itself and the suspects who came under scrutiny over the decades. Because this is where the story becomes enormously complex. Operation Norjack generated thousands of investigative leads over its history. By various accounts, the FBI investigated and cleared somewhere in the range of 1,000 named suspects over the life of the case. We are going to discuss the most significant investigative threads without accusing any living unconvicted person, because that is not what we do here. We deal in facts, public records, and verified information. The FBI worked from a set of core behavioral and physical profile elements throughout the investigation. The hijacker demonstrated apparent familiarity with parachuting. He demonstrated apparent knowledge of commercial aircraft, specifically the Boeing 727. He appeared comfortable in the company of law enforcement and airline personnel while under enormous pressure. He was methodical and calm. He was physically fit enough to contemplate a nighttime parachute jump, and he had the practical knowledge to specify the flight parameters he demanded. Early in the investigation, the FBI focused considerable attention on anyone with parachuting experience, military background, or familiarity with the Pacific Northwest. The crime occurred the day before Thanksgiving 1971, which investigators noted might be relevant, either to the hijacker's circumstances at the time, his practical calculation that holiday travel would provide more passengers and create more pressure to comply, or for reasons that have never been determined. One of the most significant early developments in the investigation was the origin of the media epithet D.B. Cooper itself. This is actually a story worth telling because it illustrates how quickly misinformation can attach itself to a high-profile case. The hijacker gave his name as Dan Cooper when he purchased his ticket. In the immediate aftermath of the hijacking, a wire service reporter, in conducting background research, contacted a man in the Portland area named D.B. Cooper, apparently looking for any person named Cooper who might be connected to the case. That man was quickly cleared of any involvement, but the name D.B. Cooper had by then been used in early news reports, and it stuck. The real alias the hijacker used was Dan Cooper. The name the world knows him by, D.B. Cooper, is a media artifact, not something the man himself ever used. There is an interesting footnote here for those who followed the case closely. In the early 1970s, there existed a French-language Belgian comic book series featuring a fictional Canadian Royal Canadian Air Force test pilot character named Dan Cooper. This character had been published since the 1950s and was popular in certain aviation circles in Europe and Canada. Whether the hijacker's use of the name Dan Cooper was a reference to this fictional character or pure coincidence is unknown. But investigators have noted the overlap as a potential cultural data point in profiling where this individual might have had roots or connections. Over the years, several suspects became prominent in public discussion of the case. I want to address these carefully, because some of the individuals named as suspects are deceased, and others involve claims that remain unverified. We will discuss only what has been established in public records and reported through credible journalistic sources verified against FBI case materials. One of the most discussed categories of suspect over the years involves individuals with military service, particularly those with parachuting training or experience in special operations. The FBI has publicly acknowledged that the hijacker's apparent comfort with the parachute equipment and his knowledge of aircraft operations suggested some background in aviation or military service, or both. Investigators looked at veterans of various branches of the military, particularly those who had served in airborne units or had worked in roles requiring parachuting proficiency. None of these investigative threads resulted in a confirmed identification or arrest. One of the more forensically significant developments in the investigation came from the analysis of the tie left behind on the aircraft. According to reports based on FBI case materials that became available through the agency's own public releases and confirmed through investigative journalism, analysts identified particles on the tie consistent with work in industrial or manufacturing environments. The specific particles identified, including titanium compounds and other rare elements, were described in public reporting as consistent with materials used in the manufacture of certain products in the aerospace or industrial manufacturing sector during that era. This forensic thread led investigators to examine individuals who had worked in relevant industries in the Pacific Northwest region during the 1960s and early 1970s. But again, no confirmed identification resulted from this line of inquiry. Now let's talk about the physical reconstruction of the jump itself, because the FBI's technical investigation of the flight path is genuinely fascinating and tells us things about who this person might have been. Using radar data from the flight, investigators were able to establish that the aft air stair pressure change, indicating deployment of the stairs, occurred at approximately 8:02 in the evening, at a position roughly over the southern Washington wilderness area. The approximate area of the jump zone, based on the aircraft's known speed, altitude, heading, and the timing of the air stair deployment, has been estimated to encompass a region of several hundred square miles in southwestern Washington, roughly in the area bounded by Lake Merwin and the North Fork of the Lewis River. This area is dense conifer forest, river canyon, and steep volcanic terrain associated with the proximity of Mount St. Helens, which would itself become famous 9 years later for an entirely different reason. Military ground search teams operating in the days and weeks after the hijacking found no trace of the hijacker. Aerial searches found nothing. As months passed without any discovery, the working theory in some quarters began to solidify around the possibility that the hijacker had not survived. The weather conditions were genuinely hostile. A nighttime jump in near zero temperatures, in rain, into a wilderness area, wearing a business suit, would have been extraordinarily dangerous even for an experienced military parachutist. For someone with less training, it could have been fatal. And the absence of any physical trace, no body, no parachute, no camping site, no discarded gear, no reports of an unknown individual emerging from the wilderness in the days after the jump, pointed in a troubling direction. But here is where the case gets philosophically interesting. The absence of evidence is not itself evidence of death. The terrain of southwestern Washington is some of the most difficult search country in North America. A parachute can disappear into a Douglas fir canopy and be invisible from the air. A human body in that wilderness, especially during winter, can be scattered by animals and covered by snowfall and vegetation within months. The absence of a body in that environment does not tell us definitively what happened. And the discovery of the money in 1980, 9 years after the event, proved that physical evidence from this case could surface years later in unexpected places. It also proved that at least some of what the hijacker was carrying entered the Columbia River watershed. Where the rest of the money went, and where the man himself went, remains unknown. Let's pause here for a moment on something that challenges our assumptions about this case. If D.B. Cooper survived the jump, what happened next? He would have landed somewhere in the Washington wilderness in the dark, in a rainstorm, in business attire and loafers, with a heavy bag of cash. He would have had to navigate out of dense wilderness, likely in freezing temperatures, without being seen or apprehended by the extensive law enforcement net that was deployed in the region. He would then have had to disappear completely, living with nearly $200,000 in marked bills that he could not safely spend for years, possibly decades. And he would have had to maintain that silence for 50+ years. No deathbed confession, no accidental slip, no associate who came forward, no spending pattern that triggered surveillance. Is that possible? Theoretically, yes. Is it probable? That is a question that has genuinely divided investigators and researchers for 50 years. What do you think? Leave your argument in the comments below. We go through every comment and this community has some genuinely sharp thinkers in it. The FBI's investigation, Operation Norjack, became one of the agency's longest-running active cases. For decades, the case was never officially closed, meaning it remained on the active investigative docket. Tips continued to pour in. Every few years, a new named suspect would emerge, either through the work of amateur investigators, through journalistic investigations, or through claims by individuals who believed they had identified the hijacker or, in several cases, believed themselves to be related to him. One notable category of these claims involves family members of deceased men who believed their relatives might have been the hijacker. In several publicized cases, family members brought evidence, including photographs, documents, and other materials, to the FBI, claiming physical resemblance to the composite sketch or other circumstantial connections. The FBI evaluated these claims and investigated the named individuals. None resulted in a confirmed identification. The agency has maintained throughout that while they received substantial volumes of potential evidence and tips, they were never able to make a definitive match between any named individual and the man who hijacked Flight 305. The FBI also made some of the case materials publicly available through the Freedom of Information Act and through deliberate public releases designed to generate new tips. In 2011, the agency released images from the case, including the tie that had been left behind, along with a description of the particles found on it. This release was specifically intended to generate leads from people with knowledge of industries or individuals connected to those materials. In terms of what the FBI publicly stated about the investigation's conclusions before suspending active work in 2016, the agency was clear on several points. They had never been able to identify the hijacker. They had investigated hundreds of named suspects without a confirmed match. They believed, based on the physical evidence and the nature of the jump, that the hijacker likely did not survive, though they could not confirm this. And they acknowledged that despite 53,000 pages of investigative documents generated over 4 decades, the case remained genuinely unsolved. Let's discuss some specific publicly documented suspects and investigative threads, drawing only from what has been reported through verified public records and credible journalism, without making accusations against anyone living or unconvicted. One of the most publicly discussed suspects over the history of the case was a man named Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. McCoy, who is deceased, was convicted in 1972 for a separate airline hijacking that bore striking similarities to the D.B. Cooper case. In April 1972, just 5 months after the Cooper hijacking, McCoy hijacked a United Airlines flight and demanded $500,000 in ransom and 4 parachutes, using a very similar method to the Cooper hijacking. He parachuted from the aircraft and was subsequently apprehended, convicted, and sentenced to federal prison. He escaped from prison in 1974 and was killed in a confrontation with FBI agents later that year. Former FBI Special Agents Carl Prober and Ralph Himmelsbach, both of whom worked the Cooper case, publicly discussed the similarities between the McCoy hijacking and the Cooper case over the years. Himmelsbach, in particular, wrote about the case in a 1986 book titled Norjack, drawing on his years of direct investigative work. However, the FBI also publicly stated that they had investigated McCoy as a potential suspect in the Cooper case and did not conclude that he was the Cooper hijacker. Physical comparisons between McCoy's known photographs and the Cooper composite sketch have been analyzed by researchers who have reached different conclusions. The FBI's official position, as reflected in public records, is that McCoy was investigated and not conclusively identified as Cooper. Other publicly named suspects, individuals deceased and named in public reporting, have included men with military parachuting backgrounds and connections to the Pacific Northwest. In each case, the FBI investigated, evaluated the evidence, and was unable to make a definitive identification. The lack of DNA comparison material for the hijacker has been a persistent obstacle. The DNA that was reportedly extracted from the tie left on the aircraft has never been matched to any suspect, because no confirmed identification of the hijacker has ever been made. The DNA exists. The matching subject does not. This is, when you step back and think about it, one of the most remarkable aspects of this case. The FBI has physical evidence. They have DNA material from the tie. They have the fingerprints taken from the aircraft, though investigators have noted that the quality and completeness of usable prints from the scene was limited. They have the ransom bill serial numbers. They have dozens of witness accounts from a flight crew who spent hours in this man's company. They have a composite sketch that has been widely circulated for 50 years. And none of it has been enough. None of it has produced a confirmed name. Why? There are several possible explanations. The most obvious is that the hijacker either died in the jump and was never found, meaning there is no living person to be identified, or that he survived and lived a sufficiently quiet and unremarkable life that he never came to law enforcement attention in a way that triggered comparison against the case evidence. Either way, the absence of a confirmed identity is not a failure of investigative technique. It is a reflection of the fundamental challenge of identifying a person about whom you know almost nothing except a physical description and a methodology. Now, before we discuss the formal suspension of the investigation and the current status of the case, I want to spend some time on the cultural legacy of D.B. Cooper, because it is genuinely extraordinary and it tells us something important about how we as a society relate to certain kinds of crime. Within months of the hijacking, D.B. Cooper had become a folk anti-hero figure. There were songs written about him. Movies were inspired by the case, including a 1981 film simply titled D.B. Cooper. Novels drew on the story. The city of Ariel, Washington, which sits near the estimated jump zone, held an annual D.B. Cooper celebration for many years, attracting Cooper enthusiasts from around the country. The local bar in Ariel became something of a shrine to the case. This cultural embrace of D.B. Cooper as a romantic figure is worth thinking about critically. This was, at its core, an act of air piracy. The passengers and crew of Flight 305 were held hostage by a man who claimed to have a bomb. The flight attendants, Tina Mucklow in particular, spent hours under enormous psychological stress in direct contact with an armed and unpredictable criminal. The passengers spent hours not knowing whether they would survive. Northwest Orient Airlines, a private company, was extorted for $200,000. These are real harms done to real people. And yet the Cooper legend persists as a story of adventure and audacity rather than victimhood. Part of this is the absence of physical violence. No one was killed. No one was physically hurt. In the landscape of crime, that matters. Part of it is the sheer audacity of the act and the perfect escape. In popular imagination, the man who jumped from a plane with a bag of cash and simply ceased to exist hits a particular note of mythological power. And part of it is the era. 1971 was a moment of deep countercultural suspicion of institutions, corporations, and federal authority. A man who stuck it to an airline and the FBI and vanished without a trace carried a certain resonance in that cultural moment. But the reality is that this was a criminal act that traumatized the people on that aircraft. And the person responsible has never faced any accountability for it. That is worth keeping in mind as we discuss the legacy. The hijacking had lasting practical consequences for commercial aviation in the United States. In the years following the Cooper case, the Federal Aviation Administration worked with Boeing to develop what became known informally as the Cooper vane, a device installed on the aft air stair of Boeing's 727 aircraft specifically to prevent anyone from lowering the stairs during flight. Airline security more broadly was significantly enhanced in the early 1970s, with the introduction of mandatory passenger screening and metal detection at airports, reforms that were accelerated by a wave of hijackings in that era, of which the Cooper case was the most dramatic. The device formally installed on the 727 to prevent in-flight stair deployment bears the informal name Cooper vane in aviation circles to this day. It is, in a strange way, this criminal's most concrete physical legacy. In July 2016, the FBI announced that it was suspending active investigation of the D.B. Cooper case. The announcement, made through the FBI's official press releases and widely covered in news media, stated that the Bureau was redirecting investigative resources that had been devoted to the case toward other priorities. The case was not being closed in the sense of being declared solved. It remains officially unsolved, but the active investigative work that had been ongoing for 45 years was being suspended. The FBI stated in its public announcement that it had pursued thousands of leads and investigated hundreds of suspects over the course of the investigation. It noted that the case had generated 53,000 pages of investigative documents. It acknowledged that the Bureau had never been able to identify the hijacker. And it invited members of the public who had new physical evidence related to the case to submit it to the FBI. But the agency was clear that absent new physical evidence of the kind that could break open the identification question, the active investigation was ending. The decision was met with a mixture of reactions. Some former investigators who had worked the case expressed disappointment. Some researchers and Cooper enthusiasts continued their own independent work. Some journalists and commentators noted that after 45 years of intensive investigation without a resolution, the suspension was understandable even if it felt like a concession to defeat. The case file remains. The physical evidence, including the tie, the recovered ransom bills now held in custody, and the voluminous documentary record, is preserved. Should new physical evidence emerge, or should advances in forensic technology make new analysis possible, the investigation could theoretically be reopened. DNA technology, in particular, continues to advance. The use of genetic genealogy, which has solved cold cases involving murders from the 1970s and 1980s, has occasionally prompted speculation about whether it could be applied to the Cooper case. But genetic genealogy requires a comparison sample from a known relative, and identifying the hijacker's relatives is impossible when you do not know who the hijacker is. It is a methodological catch-22. Without an identity, you cannot find the relatives. Without the relatives, you cannot use genealogy to confirm the identity. So where does that leave us? In 2025, more than 53 years after a man named Dan Cooper paid cash for a plane ticket in Portland, Oregon, the case remains exactly where it was on November 25, 1971 in terms of the fundamental question. We do not know who he was. We do not know if he survived. We do not know where the money went. We do not know what motivated him. We do not know anything about his life before he boarded that aircraft or, if he survived, after he left it. What we do know, with certainty, from the public record and the FBI's own documents, is this. On November 24, 1971, a man boarded Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 in Portland, Oregon. He hijacked the aircraft. He demanded and received $200,000 in ransom. He parachuted from the rear of a Boeing 727 in flight over the wilderness of southwestern Washington. He was never found and never identified. A portion of his ransom was recovered from the bank of the Columbia River in 1980. The FBI investigated the case for 45 years without a resolution. The case remains, in the FBI's own words, the only unsolved case of air piracy in the history of American commercial aviation. And here is perhaps the most haunting thought to carry away from this story. Somewhere, in a cemetery or on this earth, there is a person who knows the answer to every question we have spent 50 years asking. He is either dead and silent in the wilderness of Washington state, or he is dead in a conventional grave somewhere with a different name on the headstone, or he has lived these 50-plus years carrying the secret of what happened on the night before Thanksgiving, 1971, knowing that he is the most famous unidentified criminal in American history and that no one knows his name. The mystery does not belong to the investigators. It does not belong to the researchers or the enthusiasts or the filmmakers. It belongs to one person. And whoever that person is, they have kept it perfectly. For more than half a century. Let's take stock of where the evidence actually leads and what the most defensible conclusions are, based on the public record. Regarding survival. The balance of expert opinion, based on the conditions of the jump, the attire, the terrain, and the absence of any confirmed trace of an exit from the wilderness, leans toward the probability that the hijacker did not survive. Former FBI Special Agent Ralph Himmelsbach, who led much of the original investigation and who wrote extensively about the case in his 1986 book, was on record as believing the hijacker likely died in the jump. Other experienced investigators and former FBI personnel who have spoken publicly about the case have expressed similar views. But probability is not certainty, and the absence of a body in that terrain is genuinely ambiguous. Regarding the money, the recovery of the bills at Tina Bar in 1980 confirms that at least some of the ransom money entered the Columbia River drainage. How, when, and whether this occurred before or after the hijacker's death remains unknown. The fact that no other bills have ever been found despite 50-plus years of heightened awareness suggests either that the remaining money was destroyed, buried somewhere inaccessible, or that the person who had it has taken an extraordinary degree of care over an extraordinary length of time. Regarding identity, the FBI investigated hundreds of named suspects and ruled them all out. The physical evidence on the aircraft, including the DNA material from the tie and whatever fingerprint evidence was recovered, has never been matched to a known individual. The identity of the hijacker remains genuinely unknown, not in the sense of being strongly suspected but legally unproven. In the sense of being genuinely, fundamentally, completely unknown. This is rare. In the modern era of forensic science, surveillance technology, and interconnected databases, truly unknown criminal identities are uncommon. The Jack the Ripper murders remain unsolved, but they occurred in 1888. The Zodiac Killer operated in California in the late 1960s and early 1970s and remains unidentified, though investigators have named a person of interest and that case is still technically open. The Cooper case is different in that it occurred in the era of modern law enforcement, was responded to immediately and comprehensively, generated abundant physical evidence, and still resulted in nothing. It is, by any measure, an extraordinary investigative outcome. And perhaps that is the final thing to say about this case before we close. The D.B. Cooper hijacking is remarkable not because it was particularly violent, not because it was the largest theft in history, not because of the suffering it caused, though it did cause suffering. It is remarkable because of what it represents in the history of law enforcement and American crime. It is the case that got away. The one the FBI could not close. The one where, despite everything, the subject simply ceased to exist. It is the hole in the record. The blank page where the answer should be. And for 53 years, that blank page has drawn investigators, researchers, writers, and curious people from around the world, all trying to write a final line in a story that refuses to end. The name Dan Cooper was the only thing we ever had. We do not even know if it was a real name, a borrowed name, or a name pulled from the pages of a Belgian comic book. The man who wore it bought a one-way ticket, made his demands, collected his money, stepped off the back of a plane into a dark and stormy sky over the Pacific Northwest, and took every answer with him. Wherever he went, the case remains open for new physical evidence. If you have found anything in the wilderness of southwestern Washington, anything at all, a parachute, equipment, human remains, that could be related to this case, the FBI still wants to hear from you. The investigation may be suspended. The mystery is not. If you think you know what happened to D.B. Cooper, drop your theory in the comments. Do you think he survived the jump? Do you think he died in the wilderness and simply was never found? Do you have a theory about the money at Tina Bar? We want to hear it. This case has some of the most passionate and knowledgeable amateur investigators in the true crime community, and we go through every comment. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most enduring unsolved mysteries in American history, please like this video, subscribe to True Crime Mysteries, and turn on notifications for more true crime mysteries. New cases all the time. This video is for educational and entertainment purposes only. All information is sourced from public records, court documents, and published news. All persons are presumed innocent unless convicted by a court of law.